They did not expect the faith to survive there. Not in kitchens heavy with smoke, not in cramped rooms beneath staircases, not in the silent endurance of those who owned nothing, not even their own names. Rome expected Christianity to die where power was absent. Instead, it took root precisely there. In the first centuries, the church did not spread through senates or academies. It moved through whispers between women drawing water at dawn, through lullabies sung to children marked for abandonment, through slaves who listened while pouring wine they would never taste. These were not the voices Rome feared. They were the voices Rome ignored. Men debated gods in public squares. Women carried belief into the private world, where life was actually formed. Slaves heard the gospel while standing behind their masters, invisible yet alert, learning of a Lord who knelt to wash feet. In a civilization built on hierarchy, the message sounded quietly revolutionary. The first would be last, the last first, and all would be judged not by status, but by love. This was not strategy. It was necessity. When bishops were arrested, when leaders were executed, when names were erased from records, the faith did not disappear. It descended. It hid itself in bodies that were already used to being overlooked. Rome sought Christianity in places of influence and found emptiness. It did not think to look where suffering already knew how to endure. The disruption was subtle but profound. A faith accused of weakness refused to die among the weak. A message mocked as foolish found listeners among those who knew that power was not truth. Christianity survived not because it was protected, but because it was carried. By women whose fidelity Rome never recorded, and by slaves whose courage was never inscribed in stone. Rome named order as good and disruption as evil. Any movement that unsettled established roles was treated as a threat to cosmic balance. Christianity did not march or revolt. It did something more dangerous. It redefined worth. Women were told to be silent, useful, expendable. Slaves were property, animated tools with breath. When these groups began to gather around a crucified man who spoke to women publicly and called slaves his friends, suspicion sharpened into accusation. The faith was blamed for weakening households, corrupting obedience, dissolving ancient customs. A wife who refused to abandon her newborn daughter was labeled defiant. A slave who would not curse Christ under torture was called stubborn, irrational, diseased. Masters complained that their households no longer feared punishment as before. Something invisible had shifted, and Rome called it decay. Authorities claimed the faith spread because it appealed to the inferior. The argument sounded convincing to those who benefited from the world as it was. Only the desperate would believe such promises, they said. Only the powerless would cling to a God who died. In this way, contempt disguised itself as explanation. But beneath the accusations lay unease. Christianity did not incite rebellion, yet it weakened the logic of domination. Slaves who believed they were seen by God became difficult to own completely. Women who believed their bodies were sacred resisted being treated as disposable. The gospel did not shout against the empire, it whispered against despair. The naming of evil intensified persecution. Women were arrested not as leaders, but as carriers. Slaves were beaten not for crimes, but for loyalty. The faith was accused of spreading through contagion, as though hope itself were a disease. Rome believed it could cure this sickness with force. What it did not understand was that Christianity was already living in places force could not fully reach. It had learned to survive where voices were suppressed and choices were limited. Naming it evil did not drive it out. It only clarified where it truly lived. There were men who noticed the pattern and were disturbed by it. Roman observers, trained to read society like a map of power, saw that something was wrong with their assumptions. If Christianity was merely a superstition of the weak, why did it persist when weakness was punished? One official watched a Christian woman refuse to denounce her faith while holding a child she knew would be taken. Her calm unsettled him more than defiance would have. He expected hysteria, tears, bargaining. Instead, he saw resolve shaped by something deeper than fear. She was not powerful, yet she was unmovable. Another saw a slave endure punishment without hatred, not passive, not broken, present. When asked why, the slave answered simply that he belonged to Christ, not because he had escaped his chains, but because he had discovered a freedom no whip could reach. These answers did not fit Roman categories. Some insiders began to listen. They did not convert immediately. They observed. They noticed that women were teaching children prayers before they could speak full sentences. They saw slaves memorize stories of Jesus because they owned nothing else. Faith traveled along lines of service, not command. This disturbed the righteous order Rome claimed to defend. Christianity was not overthrowing authority, yet it was reshaping loyalty. Allegiance to Christ did not erase obedience, but it relativized it. God came first, even for those who had never been first in anything. These insiders wrote reports that struggled to explain what they witnessed. The faith was resilient because it lived where survival was already an art. Women and slaves did not join Christianity to gain advantage. They joined because it named their suffering without denying their dignity. Rome had underestimated the strength of those it dismissed. The escalation was no longer about controlling a sect. It was about confronting the possibility that the foundations of the world rested on a lie. That worth did not come from power, but from being seen by God. As persecutions intensified, the cost of belief fell hardest on those least able to bear it, at least by Roman calculation. Women lost husbands, children, protection. Slaves lost what little security they possessed. Yet these losses did not empty the church. They hollowed it in a way that made space for something unbreakable. In hidden gatherings, women led prayers because there was no one else left. They passed down stories of Christ not as doctrine, but as memory. What he said to the woman at the well, how he defended the adulteress, how he entrusted his mother to a disciple at the cross. These details mattered. They revealed a God who noticed women without using them. Slaves listened from corners and doorways, absorbing a narrative that did not promise escape, but meaning. A Lord who obeyed unto death, who was stripped, mocked, and executed like property. The cross did not erase their chains, but it placed God inside them. The descent deepened when fear entered the church itself. Parents worried about raising children into danger. Some women hid their faith to survive. Some slaves complied outwardly while praying inwardly. The line between courage and collapse blurred. The church did not pretend otherwise. It learned to carry weakness without discarding it. Rome saw this as proof of failure. A faith sustained by the marginal could not last. But the descent was deceptive. Christianity was sinking into the human condition at its most vulnerable point. It was learning to exist without protection, without recognition, without guarantees. Every martyrdom removed visible leaders. Every execution pushed the faith further into anonymity. Yet this anonymity became shelter. The church survived not by standing tall, but by kneeling low. It learned the shape of survival from those who had always lived there. There came moments when mercy was offered selectively. A woman could save herself by renouncing Christ. A slave could gain favor by cursing him. The offers were framed as kindness. Why die for something so abstract? Why cling to a belief that offered no protection? This mercy felt unjust because it demanded betrayal as its price. It asked the powerless to confirm the empire's judgment, that their faith was foolish, disposable, unworthy of sacrifice. Some accepted. Many did not. The refusals were quiet, almost invisible. but they accumulated like pressure beneath stone. A woman choosing death over denial unsettled witnesses. A slave refusing freedom at the cost of conscience exposed the hollowness of Roman mercy. Mercy that demanded the soul was not mercy. It was control disguised as compassion. The climax unfolded not in triumph, but in endurance. Christianity did not overcome Rome by force. It outlasted it by fidelity. Women and slaves bore the brunt of this endurance because they had fewer illusions to lose. The world had never promised them fairness. The gospel promised presence. Executions continued. Families were shattered. The injustice was real. God did not intervene to stop it. This was the scandal. Mercy from heaven looked like absence. Vindication was delayed. Faith was sustained by memory and hope alone. Yet something irreversible was happening. Each unjust mercy refused weakened the empire's moral authority. Each quiet martyrdom strengthened the church's interior life. The faith was being purified of ambition. It belonged fully now to those who had nothing else. The climax was not a victory scene. It was a choice repeated thousands of times by the unseen. To remain faithful without reward. To believe without power. To love without recognition. This was how Christianity survived. Through mercy that felt unjust, but revealed a deeper justice slowly taking shape. Long before persecution ended, thanksgiving filled the church, not because suffering ceased, but because gratitude had become its language. Women gave thanks while hiding scriptures in cloth. Slaves gave thanks while working fields they would never own. Thanksgiving did not follow victory, it preceded it. The Eucharist was celebrated in fragments of time, of safety, of community. Yet it remained whole. Women prepared spaces, slaves stood guard. The words were whispered, but they carried weight. This was a table where status dissolved. All received the same gift. Gradually, the empire changed. Not by decree, but by erosion. Households shaped by Christian women became different. Slaves treated as brothers altered the texture of daily life. The faith became visible not through proclamation, but through endurance. When eventually Christianity emerged into public life, it did so already formed by those who had kept it alive in the dark. Its memory was feminine and bound. Its strength was learned under obedience and care. Thanksgiving had shaped it more than triumph ever could. Victory, when it came, felt almost secondary. The faith had already survived its hardest test, not expansion, but preservation. It had learned to exist without power, and therefore could be trusted with it. The story leaves a question that does not belong only to the past. Where does God choose to dwell when power withdraws? History answers quietly, among those the world overlooks. Christianity survived because women and slaves carried it when no one else could. Not as strategy, but as fidelity. God did not choose the strong to preserve his church. He chose the faithful. The question remains, when faith is pressured, misunderstood, or dismissed, where will it live now? In institutions alone, or in the hidden endurance of those who have learned to love without recognition? God's question lingers in the silence after the story ends. Will you look for him where the world teaches you not to look? Or will you miss him again, standing quietly among those who carry hope without power, sustaining the faith in ways history only later dares to name? O Lord, who chose what the world overlooked, we thank you for the women and the slaves who carried your church through darkness. Teach us to remain faithful when unseen, courageous when powerless, and grateful even before deliverance comes. May we recognize your presence in quiet endurance, serve without seeking reward, and trust that your kingdom grows not by strength, but by love that refuses to abandon hope. Amen.